Okay, welcome to the CogSciSci curriculum chat on inheritance, variation and evolution. I'm Dom Shibley, Senior Lecturer in Teacher Training at the University of Hertfordshire. I've been doing that for 3 years. Prior to that, I taught science and biology in state secondary schools for 20 years. Now, I'm going to introduce you to everyone in the chat today. So Pritesh, over to you.
Hi, my name is Pritesh Raichura. I'm the Head of Science at Michaela Community School, and I've been teaching for 6 years.
Hi, I'm Jo Castellino, and I've been teaching for 6 years at the school in West Yorkshire.
My name is Rachel Wong, and I'm a science teacher at Vision Cliff School. I've been teaching for about 4 years.
I'm Christian. I teach in a state international school in Spain. I did do a bit of teaching in English before I came out, and I think now it's about 9 years I've been teaching, and I currently do mainly more biology than anything else.
Right, so you've met everyone, and we're going to get straight into it with our first question. And the question we're going to discuss is, what do students find hard about inheritance, variation and evolution? So over to you, Jo.
This topic is massive, and I think one of the biggest challenges that our students face is the terminology, because we don't really come across the language that we use here in many other places, like the word alleles, for example. There are also a lot of misconceptions, things like one gene, one trait, or that evolution is linear. So there are so many of these tricky concepts that are introduced to students in this topic, and it's all at once as well. And I think that can be a bit overwhelming for students. I think that's something we should try and address as we teach it.
Yeah, so to add to that, I would say one of the things that people find really tricky about evolution and inheritance is firstly the time scale of it. And I think that yeah, everyone's nodding along. The idea that evolution just happens really quickly within a few generations, and that's always the case, can be a misconception. And of course, the answer really is that it varies so much depending on the organism and how often it reproduces and the selection pressures. And it then becomes such a nuanced idea that it becomes very tricky, and teachers have to strike a balance between, I guess, how easy it is to explain the idea of evolution in simple terms to begin with and build up that complexity, versus kind of going for the truth of the idea and remaining faithful to the idea of natural selection and evolution. So I think that in itself is a big challenge. And I agree, the language and terminology is something that people do find tricky, because there is just such a huge number of words that people need to learn. And then I think the other thing is, because it is ultimately a theory, and I guess when you think about the GCSE specification, for example, there aren't necessarily set examples that pupils need to learn about. And so the examples pupils are exposed to by teachers vary a lot. And I think depending on which examples you use and the number of examples you use and how you present those examples, the pupils' understanding of evolution can vary quite dramatically. So I think one of the trickiest things for pupils to understand is this kind of really abstract and general idea, because it applies to so much of life. It is, all of, everything in biology makes sense, or doesn't make sense, except in the light of evolution, as it was famously said. And I think that the examples that are chosen really have a big influence on that. So I think that if the examples aren't well chosen, that can prove a real challenge for pupils as well.
Yeah, I think pretty much everything I was thinking about is already been mentioned about the terminology and sort of the timescale or the context of it. I think for them it's a massive topic. Like words, alleles, genotypes, phenotypes. For them, it's almost like learning a different language. And so it's almost try to get them to be fluent in that language and then be able to explain something. It's actually quite a big jump, I think, for students to actually get across, especially in this topic, because there's just so many different new words and concepts in there. And then the idea about the context bit, like what Pritesh has already mentioned as well, it's the examples that they can see. So, and also the misconceptions that can come up from it. For example, a lot of them think in natural selection, when they try to explain it, they would start saying, because of a selection pressure, then the animals can choose to change and choose to adapt to that environment. And you have to, and there seems to be such a major misconception in a lot of their brains, and they think that that's true. And then you have to really try hard to rectify that and saying, no, it's pre-existing variations that leads to the other things. But I think that could also be easily changed by if we change the sequence of things. But I think for them is trying to understand all of these, fix these misconceptions that they had before, and while trying to learn almost like a new language or all this new terminology, and understanding the scale of things, like from small bits like antibiotic resistant bacteria up to evolution of larger animals, for example, could be like I think it could be difficult for them to understand the scope of it, really. But yes, that's what I think that might find hard about.
Yeah, I think this is. I look through the AQA syllabus that you've got there, and this. You can go through quite a lot of the syllabus. You know, you don't have to understand digestion to understand biology, but this topic here, this is so fundamental to your understanding of nature around it, that when people say it's a massive topic, it means it's massive, not just in content, but in terms of depth of understanding. And I think one of the problems is we have in Key Stage 3, we go from quite a Darwinian perspective. So we're looking at phenotypes, and people might be talking about natural selection, but we're really looking at the scale of the organism. And it's in Key Stage 4 where suddenly we start, instead of just dipping in and out of the molecular scale, suddenly we're really going down deep there, and we're asking questions. Well, we've seen this natural selection in Key Stage 3, but now we want to dig a bit deeper on what are the mechanisms, and that's a big shift in perspective for the students. We're going from this like Darwinian up to the modern synthesis, where suddenly we're trying to connect these ideas to genes, and that's when you get all this crazy vocabulary from the 20th century of alleles, homozygous, etc. All of these things, and Mendelian genetics. So that shift in perspective for me, jumping from Key Stage 3, where we're looking more phenotypical, suddenly down to trying to map genotype phenotypes, and that shift in perspective alone is enough to derail their understanding of everything else in that topic.
Thanks, Christian. Some really good points there about making those connections. From what Rachel was saying about the difficulties that students have and why they kind of assume that things grow, you know, I often think that Hollywood, X-Men and things like that have a big part to play in the misconceptions that students pick up, because they think, well, if the world becomes flooded, then we'll grow gills. And you think, well, actually, probably we won't. Somebody else will take over. And thinking about inheritance, have you ever thought, for me, I've taught it, and I have a student go, well, I look just like my mum. And so you then try but you do realize you have had half of your chromosomes from your father. But no, I look just like my mum. So there's almost this idea that actually one parent's DNA has overridden the other. And so that's something I often think that's quite tricky to overcome. And also because students, when they hear things from their parents, they tend to believe it a lot more than they perhaps do from their teachers as well. And it's difficult to break that cycle of belief there. And I've always been quite frustrated, never quite worked that one out really, about characteristics being inherited. And also I suppose, you know, the idea of the misconception of that actually variation is down to sexual reproduction as well. It's not just reacting to the environment, which is also something I think they find difficult to see because of the abstract nature of what we're trying to teach them. So we've thought about what students have found hard. What about teachers? What do you think they find difficult about teaching inheritance, variation, and evolution? Rachel?
I think actually what we've talked about earlier kind of very much links to this part, is the fact that there is just so much content. And I think as a teacher, you always have to try to teach everything very quickly, because you need to fit everything in there before you finish, because it's kind of near the end of the specification in a sense. So you're kind of trying, for me at least, I always often find that I start to run out of time when I get to that part of the course. And it's just trying to make sure they learn everything, and try to make sure they learn everything well enough to understand it. And then to have enough time for practice, for retrieval practice, so that they know the key facts. And then also to do exam question practice, etc. So it's like trying to teach it isn't necessarily hard, but trying to teach it well is the challenge here. Is making sure that they can understand everything properly within the given time frame is the major thing. And I think sometimes it's tricky for students and also for teachers, unless you kind of get the experience of it, is to try to make sure it links, to form some good synoptic links to other topics as well. So kind of what everyone sort of mentioned already about the context, or the links to all of the fundamental stuff, like what Christian had mentioned about how genetics pretty much underlies everything in life, from the formation to a small prokaryotic cell, to eukaryotic animals and plants, and to medicine, to genetic technologies, like also what Dom mentioned about movies as well. So I definitely have shown a couple of movie clips about cloning and other things in the lesson as well, to illustrate like how we've got the technology and everything, and actually trying to fit. It's a really, really interesting and very important topic, but then trying to teach all of that in a very short time frame can be tricky, I think, especially when you're not too familiar with all of the things that have been mentioned. So it could be quite challenging.
Yeah, I agree. I think also the media has a big role to play here as well. I mean, the recent example of a big news channel saying that RNA was a cell. I don't know if anyone else saw that, but it's just a lot of stuff out there about genes and evolution that our students come in with. And that can be tricky for teachers to try and address as well, especially if the teacher is also a non-specialist. I think sometimes that can be very tricky for trying to remove some of the misconceptions. Very basic stuff like, for example, you have a gene that codes for a characteristic, for example, and that's not entirely true. And the interaction between genes and the environment is so massive as well. It's very important. But I don't think that's usually clear, especially at key stage 3. So I think those are some of the other problems as well, being a specialist in the subject versus being non-specialist. So some more CPD or training would be useful here. But also, like I said, the media just confusing everybody, and that doesn't help, even now.
Yeah, so one thing I would add is something about a sort of a pedagogical approach that teachers have when teaching this topic. So, I mean, is there one kind of pedagogical approach that teachers around the country use to teach this topic? I mean, I don't think so, not that I've come across. And one thing that an example of what I mean is when teaching chemistry, coming across the idea of Johnston's triangle, and I think Christian alluded to this earlier, where in chemistry you can look at things from kind of 3 different lenses, one being the macroscopic, the observable, what do you notice is happening in a chemical reaction, then the microscopic, which is what's happening at the atomic level, and understanding the link between what's happening at the observable level and what's happening at the atomic level, and finally the symbolic level, so that the equations and the language we use to describe what's going on in those reactions. And I think, is there something equivalent in biology that helps teachers to decide and have some sort of framework around which they can teach the ideas of inheritance, the ideas of evolution and natural selection? And I think perhaps there's something you can map onto from chemistry into biology, and that's been touched on already, is the idea of the genes, what's going on at the molecular level, and linking that to what's going on at the the whole organism level and at the population level. And I think, you know, Christian's written some excellent blogs on this, where he talks about moving between the different levels of organization. And I think that as a framework can be really useful when planning this topic, because it gives you a really concrete way in which you are aware, I'm taking my pupils on a journey from this level to this level. I'm going to make sure I make it really explicit. And the second thing I would say that teachers find difficult, as Rachel alluded to as well, is the time limitation. And that makes me think, and this is, I guess, something that everyone across the country perhaps is working on. Curriculum is the big thing at the moment, is how well does your Key Stage 3 curriculum prepare your pupils to then start the Key Stage 4? Because if you imagine that all the kind of, there's lots of knowledge that your pupils have at their fingertips ready, so that when they start Key Stage 4 and you go into those key words, you already have loads of examples. I remember we learned about this example of this animal and this ecosystem. That's an adaptation, and here are some of the genes that help contribute towards it. This is how it evolved. And if you could have that really well sequenced curriculum that draws on previous knowledge and you can rely on that previous knowledge, I think that would really help teachers. But that's a big project, I guess.
Yeah, I think when I look at the syllabus, I see, and Rachel was saying that she starts running out of time, and I can see that on the syllabus it's like the penultimate topic, and straight away I'm thinking, how can something so fundamental, you know, be the penultimate topic? And there's two ways you can go about it. You can either make sure it's not the penultimate topic, and you start pushing it much further towards the beginning, or you can start integrating it into all the previous topics, and you've always got to have this foresight. You know, you're going to have this problem of descending and ascending levels of organization. You know that it's coming. You know, you think of all these fundamental parts that need to be put together to get genotype phenotype maps to make sure there's no misconceptions. And then you start, when you're teaching your topic there of organization, you're putting it in there. You know, you've got that foresight. This is coming. They're going to need to know how to descend and ascend and think about different scales and systems at different scales. So it's either that you have to either integrate it and have this foresight, but I would really prefer that topic to be much earlier, because it's like you're giving the students the idea that you can go through the rest of the course and not have to know the details of evolution to understand it, but really you can't understand biology without understanding inheritance and evolution. So it's got to be early, or it's got to be integrated, and that's where the difficulty comes, I think, for teaching, because rather than it really is such a fundamental part of biology, and it's all concentrated into one topic. You know, you've got, if you're doing the digestive system, you've got lots of things that are linking. You've got your levels of organization, you've got enzymes, which are quite new, and catalysis and stuff like this. But when you get to this topic, there's so many links that are actually fundamental links. They're really important, the basis of most of the things. And I think that it's that real density of importance that makes it really difficult for a teacher just coming up to the topic and they're like, wow, this is dense stuff, you know. And that's for me why really, if I were AQA, I would have put some of that stuff a bit early, you know, some building in, maybe inheritance and variation should be much earlier. You know, you're building up to natural selection. So that it's like, wow, we've talked about this stuff, you know, for ages, you know, let's get the details of natural selection. You know, you've already covered bits integrated earlier. Yeah, for me, that's the biggest problem, and especially as I think it was Joe was saying, you've got a non-specialist and they bump into this topic near the end of the course, and it's like, oh, you know, whoa, what we're going to do this, you know, and that's a tough topic to come up against, especially towards the end. It's got to be, it's part of the dialogue, isn't it? It's got to be part of your dialogue. Maybe it's not necessarily the plan of your lesson, but you've got, that's the specialist has that, you know, that non-linear thinking, and it's part of that dialogue. It might not be part of the planned lesson, but it's coming in, it's popping in there. You're talking about surface area in the intestine. It's just like, well, you know, let's do how would it compare to individuals with less or more surface area? And it's just the non-linear thinking and non-specialist bringing it all in. So by the time you get to that topic, it's not so dense. There's ideas you're already building on, but if it's left until that moment, then it really, you are coming up against a big hill to climb.
Can I ask all of you a question then? Thanks, Christian. And this is, in some respects, I think I've taken this directly from the specification, which is the idea of, you know, students need to know the function of the gene and, you know, the chemical basis of inheritance. So it's the idea that one gene codes for a protein. How on earth do you, you know, as teachers in the classroom, what do you do to help them conceptualize that? Because for me, I always found it tricky when I would talk about eye color, and then I would talk about, you know, blood groups, and then something else. So the proteins and what they then are manifest as are very different from each other. And they often found that very difficult to conceptualize as well. So any thoughts on how, say, teachers could overcome that sort of subject knowledge challenge? Any thoughts, or have I?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult. And part of the problem is most traits are actually invisible, because it's like so many of our genes code for our body plan, for example, and it's the same between everyone. And a lot of them are things that you learn about later on, like transcription factors, which they don't really learn about at GCSE. And so the idea of, you know, regulation and all the nuances of genetics that actually as specialists we perhaps appreciate, but as someone teaching a GCSE course, you may not, if you're a non-specialist, won't really know much about. It then limits the number of examples that you can use, and that the ones I use in textbooks are often the same across different textbooks. And so it seems very baffling that a gene can code for something like hemoglobin, and also something like keratin in the hair, and something like somehow code for your eye color. Yeah, so that's not an answer to the question. It's more why this is really tricky.
It is tricky, but then certainly the AQA specification then throws in one sentence that kind of says, but inheritance is not based on single genes. You know, and so then all of a sudden, but then of course you just do Punnett squares and it's all monohybrid crosses. But yet there's this one little bit that just kind of adds an extra complication, I think, that makes it difficult for them to conceptually get.
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry.
No, go on, Joe.
Christian, go first.
Yeah. I think this comes, one of the big problems I think here is really about the theory of knowledge rather than biology itself. And we see on Twitter all day the physicists talking about the models, and then the chemists will come and talk about their models. And are we teaching reality? Are we teaching a simplified model? And I don't think in biology we do that so much. And we're not teaching reality because it's too complicated for any of us to fully understand. So I think really we start by telling students, like, when we get to Mendel, it's like, this is a model, you know, because it's pretty complicated stuff. And Mendel was pretty clever because he bred out all the complications and he created this model for us. And we're using this because it's useful for us to try and understand how, if in a more complicated way, we would understand it. But this is the simplified model. And I think, yeah, I mean, do we fully understand? Do we understand? Do any of the here really understand genotype, phenotype maps? I don't think anybody really understands it, do they? I mean, we've all got our models ourselves. Ours are just a bit more complex than the students. So, yeah, for me, I think maybe in biology, this is something that I've been thinking about recently, and I realised that even you know, I'm not talking enough about models in biology. This is a model, and it's simplified, and because it's complicated stuff. You know, sorry, Joe. Now you can.
Joe, over to you.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, exactly as Christian said, they're all models. It's based on the evidence we've got right now. This is how we teach it. The only thing that we can do, I think, to make it very simple, is to have concrete examples at the start. You know, something that they can link things to. Eye color can be quite tricky, I think. You know, flower petal colors maybe, or you know, something very, very straightforward, very simple, and then try and build on that. And also I wanted to say something about Christian's earlier point about integrating the topic earlier on, which will help with the challenges that we might face when we teach it at the end, nearly at the end of the syllabus. It might also help to spread out the terminology a little bit better as well, rather than just bombarding our students right at the end with everything and then trying to apply that as well. So it might, yeah, I think just making it very explicit to them that this is what we're basing all of this on, the information we've got currently, and things do change, and it might change in a lifetime as well, who knows. That's it.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Christian and Joe have mentioned. It's the fact that it's a model, because actually written down Punnett squares represent a model of inheritance. So when we're teaching them about the classic example, I don't know about you guys, but for me it's definitely the eye color. I always start with the eye color, blue eye colors and brown eye colors. Who's got brown eyes? Who's got blue eyes in your room? But then, and they very much they find Punnett squares okay, because it's very much like you just draw a square and you simply illustrate the concept of values, and then you can model it over and over again, and they would be comfortable with that. But then very quickly the students will realize, what about people with green eyes and gray eyes? You've got a spectrum of colors. And then usually when I get that question, I go into a bit more detail about how the genes, for example, that we just simplify it. The gene codes for a protein called melanin, and actually it's the amount of this protein in the body that represent, that affects the color of your hair and your eyes. But it's always telling them the fact that something I've noticed in Bargain, actually in a lot of things, is that there are always going to be exceptions to the model. We always come across something that is unique. Like when you talk about A type blood, B type blood, and O type blood, and then the kids will go, what about AB? What about A minus? Or I'm not familiar with blood type, but they always say, what about that extra one bit? And then I think it's then telling them the fact that everything that we're teaching them is just what we already know. Like it's the evidence that we've gathered so far that has formulated we've got Mendel with the Punnett squares and everything. So that's one way that we could use to understand how genetics work. We use Darwin's evidence to think about how evolution works, but we have to, I think it's important to emphasize to them that this is the theory of evolution by natural selection. It's what we have observed. And I think one of the ways to tell them that this is not the end of our knowledge is the fact that to say, and actually that's part of the AQA separate spec, is to show them the history of the development of knowledge of genetics, like from Mendel, Darwin, Wallace, everything, like to show them the journey of development in terms of our knowledge in this. And to say, who knows, maybe in the future, you will then grow up. You notice this exception, maybe you'll then grow up and go on to study the course in university, and then we go on to do research, and you'll start to find out there are other reasons for these exceptions. And I think it's, I don't know, for me, it is a little bit poetic, I guess, but it's just, I think it's wonderful for the students to realize that this is an ongoing journey, for them to know that actually you might be able to discover something brand new. And is to try to stimulate them to think more about this and how we can use this in everyday life, and which something I'm sure we'll talk about later on. It's how do we use our knowledge on future technologies, on genetic technologies, and that's another thing that they are really interested about because of all the movies and things that they read at the So, but yeah, I think what Joe's meant definitely is to start with, to answer the question, I guess, is the concrete examples like polydactyly, which is definitely covered, and cystic fibrosis. These are examples that we could definitely use as a starting point, but then tell them that we don't know everything yet, but that's something that we may be able to find out in the future.
And I suppose my final question to you all is, if you're teaching inheritance, do you tend to use the same models all the way through? So if you're going to do flowers and petal color, will you refer to that again and again and again? And if you're doing, say, brown and black fur, do you just keep reinforcing those, or do you try and give many different examples? I really like the eye color. I stopped doing eye color and just ended up talking about brown and black fur, to be honest, because at that point it just meant I reduced the number of questions I would have about, well, I've got gray eyes, sir, and so started building my topic around those real specifics. okay, I'm just going to focus on fur for now. I'm just going to focus on maybe plants and petal colors. And of course, in the old spec, you had codominant. So your petals could be white or red and then go pink, which would be even more confusing. But I'm just throwing those out there because what I think we should do is, Pritesh, if we move on to the next one, which is about the sequence. And if you want to share your screen and perhaps talk us through that, and then we'll think a bit more about how you might sequence this topic in your school.
Can you all see that on the screen now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I've just put together an example sequence. This isn't necessarily the sequence I've used to teach, but I think part of the reason we want to do this is as teachers around the country are developing their schemes of work, their curriculum and their sequencing, I think it'll be really fascinating to hear a group of teachers discuss how they would sequence. And so I guess I'll just share some thoughts about what I think would and wouldn't work, and others will chip in. And I guess it's the point of this is just to think out loud and to think about some of the reasons why you might sequence something in a particular way and reasons why you may not sequence something in a particular way. So this would be a Key Stage 4 scheme of work. This covers the key ideas in the AQA combined science part of the specification on inheritance, variation and evolution. And in this particular sequence, we're starting with species, what species are and their adaptations. Now, immediately that strikes me as potentially a good thing to do because adaptations are so observable, and that's something we mentioned before. The more concrete, the more observable that you start off with, the easier it is for people to latch on further knowledge onto that. So you might start by sharing lots of concrete examples of different animals, plants, bacteria, fungi, whatever it might be, that have specific adaptations which help them to survive, which make them more likely to survive, more likely to reproduce. And so you're kind of building in this knowledge of a bank of examples so they can appreciate what the word adaptations means and what different species are. I think variation early on in a sequence is also a good thing, partly because one of the key principles, so I guess I've touched on one principle of sequencing, which is concrete first is often better than abstract first because it gives you something to think about. But the second thing, I guess, that's evident here in this sequence is that there are some things that have to come logically prior to other things. So if you start teaching natural selection, you'll realize, well, actually, to understand natural selection, you need to know what variation is, because variation is a prerequisite for selection to occur. So it has to come before selection. There's no way you would teach it the other way around. So that's, I guess, one of the second principles we can think about when sequencing. So concrete first and logically prior things come earlier on, so that they make sense. And I think it's interesting that with the environmental, the contrast between genetic, environmental, and variation caused by a mixture of the two. I think you can't. I think the easiest one here is to teach environmental variation, because it's easy to say, look, he's got a tattoo, he doesn't. That's environmental variation. He's got a piercing, or she's got piercings, he's got piercings. This person doesn't. That's environmental variation. And it's kind of, people get that straight away because they've had experiences of getting scars, or they know people who have tattoos and people who don't. There'll be people in the room who have piercings and people who don't. But as soon as you say genetic, then does that require knowledge which is then comes later on? So should this perhaps come first before you move on to teaching genetic variation? If you explain genetic variation, will it have much meaning unless you've already talked about DNA? So perhaps DNA ought to come first, and maybe it should come earlier on in the sequence rather than later, would be some of my early thoughts. I guess one more thing I would say is, one thing I've come to the conclusion to thinking about this, and having taught this over the course of several years, is selective breeding and natural selection obviously go hand in hand, but I think that putting selective breeding before natural selection I think is easier to understand. And I think perhaps that's another principle in sequencing that I've come to think about more, is what is easier to understand, teach that first. And the reason I think selective reading is easier to understand is because there's one less thing that people need to think about, which is the idea that nature is somehow causing differential survival between different organisms. And it's just, I'm going to pick the frogs with the longest legs to reproduce, and that's it. I've decided that, and that's fine. And therefore, over many generations, we find that the leg length of the frogs will get longer and longer. Seems easier to understand than to have the extra step, because it is an extra conceptual leap to think if they have shorter legs, that means they're less likely to be able to jump away from a predator, and therefore they're less likely to survive, and therefore they're less likely to breed. There's a whole causal chain there that's an addition to the idea of selective breeding. And I think by putting selective breeding prior to natural selection, it can be easier to then master the idea that the things that survive go on to reproduce, pass on their genes, and that can cause a change over many generations. And then when you go on to natural selection, the difference is that the end part is the same, it's just the beginning part that's different. It's who's doing the selecting. Is it a human that's deciding, or is it nature? And the idea of that trait being adaptive or not, and that nuance can be built in. So I think for me, those are three things that stand out: concrete first, logically prior stuff first, and easier stuff first, where possible, as kind of principles for sequencing.
Thanks, Pritesh. There's a compelling argument you put forward there. Joe, what do you think?
I quite like how it starts, actually, and that is very similar to how we start the topic at Key Stage 3 as well. We talk about variation first, and we do talk about DNA and chromosomes and genes at Key Stage 3 in our school. So it's very similar to what you put up there, but it is, I think, like you said, very tricky to talk about genetic variation examples before we introduce the word DNA. So at Key Stage 4, we kind of stick to the AQA order as much as possible, where we would talk about DNA first, and then you talk about variation somewhere in the middle of the topic. In terms of the selective breeding and natural selection, I really like that, actually. I've never thought of that before. But I really like the fact that after you teach natural selection, it does flow much better into the evidence for evolution, because I've always, I must admit, thought that teaching selective breeding randomly at the end, it doesn't fit quite as well. Whereas here, I think I quite like how that looks, where you teach something, like you say, something concrete, something that makes a more logical sense, and then move on to the theories based on the evidence that we've got. And that would flow much nicer. That's what I'm thinking.
Rachel?
Yeah, as I kind of mentioned before we started, I was thinking about this yesterday, preparing for this one, and what Pritesh has put up is very similar to what I had in mind. Because at the moment, for us, we teach according to the order in the textbook that we use, and they started with, which actually, when I say it won't make much sense, but they start with number 6, sexual reproduction, about meiosis, and then go to compare to asexual reproduction, because that's something we teach in year 9. And then they go into DNA, and then back to alleles, and then all about the different examples of genetic diseases. And it's about midway through, then we talk about variation and natural selection, and then straight to selective breeding and genetic engineering, and then jumping back to adaptations in species. So when I put it out like that, we follow the textbook. And actually, I was thinking about this yesterday. I was thinking, it doesn't make sense to do it this way. It's just so all over the place. And I was thinking, like what Patricia exactly mentioned, concrete to abstract. We should start with something that they already know from Key Stage 3, which is species and adaptation, and that's something they can easily see. Like you can easily put up many examples of different species, like animals that you can see in the zoo, or plants, or food that we eat, and variation. You can illustrate that quite easily by just looking across the class and saying who's got long hair, who's got short hair, who's got piercings or not, what color eyes you've got if we want to go into genetics bit. So what Patricia's put up here makes a lot more sense than what we have been doing in the past couple of years. I really like the idea of mixing it about in this way, so that actually when students are looking at it, they have a more sort of coherent idea about a development of the ideas, rather than our original plan about jumping it all over the place. So that is certainly a very interesting thing. But and also the other thing is, you mentioned about selective breeding coming before natural selection, and I have to say it is, I've never thought of that before, because I always thought about going through, to me, the alleles and the DNA part is the basic science behind everything. That's what we know as the biological science there. And then I always go for, and actually that's something I've written down before, it's in terms of the context, going from the past to the present to the future. So for me, it's like knowing the fundamental biology, which is the DNA structure, chromosomes and alleles and everything. Then we can go to the past, sort of, about natural selection and how do we know about that, the evidence for evolution and everything. And then, which can then further develop our understanding of the genetics part, and then going on to the future bit, which is, so, well, I say future bit, which is selective breeding and genetic engineering and cloning. So to show them, in my head, that's sort of how it's working. It's that journey of how we have developed our knowledge throughout time and how we can use it for in the future, and then further on discussing the pros and cons of these technologies. But I have to say, I feel like what you put up there is makes a lot more coherent sense, if that makes sense. And that's certainly something that I would think more about, and maybe talk with the department and see how we could fix things around. But it is really interesting to be talking about this now. So yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Christian, I'm muted. Yeah. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm in danger of sounding like a broken record here or something, but it relates to what I've said already. Is I mean, you look at the specification, and I think as soon as you look at it, it really constrains your thinking, and it's put content into boxes. And as much as teachers may mix topics, within a topic, I mean, natural selection, for example, is put in a box. And for me, natural selection is biology. It's everywhere. It's not in a box. So it's not like it should be in a place. And we've got to think more that just because we have these details of natural selection specified, we can break up those details and we increase the nuance of our framework as we go through biology education. I mean, for me, natural selection, you start talking about it in year 7. But when you get to key stage 4, even within this topic itself, you can begin with the very basics of natural selection. And really what Darwin and Wallace discovered really is quite simple in itself, and it barely needed discovering. It was the details that came in the 20th century with the modern synthesis, which start complicating things. So I see in the syllabus that they've got you actually have to teach the story of Wallace, Darwin. There's not a better story in science, I think. And Wallace was out there in the jungles, and he was spotting the distribution of animals, and he was asking these really basic questions that are really open to students. You know, I mean, why did the animals in Papua New Guinea look similar to the ones in the desert in Australia, whereas the ones over the Wallace Line in the same climate, pretty much the same environment, are really different. The difference between placental mammals and marsupials, and it's just these deep questions that you begin with, and then you start talking about natural selection on a really big phenotypic level. Otherwise, when I look at this, if the students are not like thinking in this way, if you've not got this framework of thinking, you know, I want them to see the content through these eyes. You know, if they're not doing that, then we're kind of like building a wall. We're adding the bricks. You know, we're going through this list. We're adding the bricks, and then we get to the end, and it's kind of like, look at the wall. Can you see the wall now? You know, Whereas really what I want them to see is at the beginning is like we're heading to this wall, and we're putting the bricks in, but they're adding to the story as we go along. And you can only get that story if we begin with natural selection at the beginning. And like I said, with a limited framework, you can just talk about phenotypic differences, differential survival, and reproduction. And by the time we've got to the end of the topic, we've added to this bigger framework, and now students are working more on a molecular level with allele frequencies and stuff like that. So really, yeah, natural selection for me begins in year 7. You know, in the very first topics of biology, rather than having it in a place. It's everywhere. You know, it's distributed natural selection.
Well, thanks, Christian. Any, I suppose, challenges to Christian about, about this idea? For 20 years, I reckon in year 7, I've started every biology topic I've ever taught on cells without fail. And they've learnt the animal cell and the plant cell and the structures of that. And would you suggest, Christian, that maybe that's not the right place to start? Or
well, I mean, you've probably read a lot of my blogs anyway, but what I'm saying is we're not necessarily you start a topic of natural selection. You start with the topics you want to start with, but it's part of the fabric of every topic is natural selection. And what you're doing is through secondary education is you're building the complexity of that framework with which students can see the world, you know. And so when we get to key stage 4, we're just adding the extra details of the modern synthesis. But it's very easy for us to talk in year 7, even if you begin with cells. You can already start talking. You can be looking at videos of amoeba or whatever, and start talking about why do they even reproduce? You know, what's the point? You know, that's how I normally start. What is the point in all of this? Like we talk about energy flows, matter flows, but what's the point? Because and the kids will automatically go to the naive idea, the pre-Dawgsonian idea that they're doing it for the good of the species or whatever, and then you change their view a bit, and you start going to the Dawgsonian ideas and the selfish DNA, and you've got the Weissman barrier. And I think for me that's always a starting point, and because I want all the next topics, like I said, whatever topics they may be, they've got to see them a specific way. I've got to have them referring to an abstract theory rather than just building knowledge sequentially and hoping at some point it will all come together to produce this idea of a theory. You know, rather it's part of the fabric of biology itself.
Well, Christian, I to be honest, I could carry on listening to you because I really like, what you're doing is you're not accepting the orthodoxy of this is what we do, and you're thinking about it and really pushing that. And it's just fascinating. Pritesh, can I come back to you as a final response to what you've heard and any thoughts that you might finally have?
Yeah, so I think what Christian is saying is really interesting. I think so. I agree with you that we're not building towards the idea of natural selection saying, oh, this is it, now we've looked at it, let's move on. I think that you're right, that we do need to think more about how we start at key stage 3, and actually how I'm intending to, in changing our curriculum, start in key stage 3 is actually starting with the biology section in key stage 3 in year 7 to be about ecology, and starting with the observable and actually saying, look, here's the animal kingdom, here's the plant kingdom, here are lots of examples of animals and plants in different ecosystems, and these are some of the adaptations they have. All organisms have, I mean, I guess you can use the word evolved without them understanding what it means, but organisms, so they survive and they reproduce, and everything you notice about an organism helps those two things to happen. And so I want to build in this idea that survival and reproduction is what biology is all about. I don't think I want to explicitly refer to natural selection in year 7. Partly, I mean, I might refer to the idea that that, you know, so I am talking about selection in a sense. I'm talking about characteristics that organisms have might make survival more likely or reproduction more likely, but I might not use the term natural selection, or I might not explain the idea that Darwin had. I'm just sticking to the observable and hoping that they see that, yeah, of course, organisms want to survive, they want to reproduce. And you're building a framework with which they can see things around them. So when they see a tree growing up tall, they're thinking, how is it, why is that helping it to survive or reproduce more? How is that helping? Why is this plant really short, but this plant really tall? And being able to get them to make those links is something that ultimately I think all of us as biologists want from our pupils. And I think that the curriculum, you're right, needs to build layer by layer towards this understanding. But I think there needs to be a point where you explicitly say, this is natural selection and this is Darwin's idea. And I think that actually that should come in Key Stage 3, and this would be a kind of revisiting in Key Stage 4. I haven't thought exactly about where in Key Stage 3 I would introduce it, or perhaps it's one of those in Year 9 intermediate topics. But yeah, I do agree with you that it's not something that you then come up to and then move on from. It is something that you want to build into their understanding as a whole. And I think that what's tricky is, it as a teacher who's pressed for time, it's really easy to say, let's just follow the spec order. And I understand that, and it's you know, changing curriculum is really hard. It takes lots of time. It's a collaborative effort for the department. But I think it's a worthwhile thing to do if as a goal you're working towards, because as you say, it changes the gaze that the pupils have. The way in which they look at the world will change based on the examples and the sequencing that you use, and the way that you build up the idea of what life is. And I think that's really important.
Thanks, Pritesh. Oh, go on then, Rachel.
I was just adding to what we've been hearing so far. I do agree that, like, in Key Stage 3, we definitely do talk about this, but maybe not using the terminology necessarily as such. We don't necessarily teach it in Key Stage, in Year 7, but we do talk about we don't talk about meiosis, but we talk about sexual reproduction in Year 7. But certainly in Year 8, we then put in the idea about variations and adaptations first, because, as you said, the observable, and I think students tend to find that quite easy to understand because they can actually see it. And then we move on to a bit more into DNA and chromosomes, and then moving on to natural selection a little bit more, without going into like what Christian said about the minute detail about, you know, about all of the detailed keywords and etc. in it. But I think it's quite important for them to actually have an idea about that to start with. And actually, I feel like a lot of people, when they think about biology, they do quite naturally think, I like to think of it this way, they naturally think about evolution as a concept because it is one of the most important biological concepts in the biological world. I think it underpins everything, and it's not explicitly pointed out all the time, but I think subconsciously people talk about it because when you go to a museum, when the kids go to the museum, when you talk about biology, the biology section, you always see fossils, you always see skeletons, you always see something that talk about the change throughout time, about evolution. You always see it, and I think that it's just not explicitly said that this is something that underpins everything that we know about biology. So I think actually having it in Key Stage 3 is a really good idea, about having them, you know, kind of reinforcing the idea about, yeah, natural selection and evolution has been happening, and it's not stopped, it's continuing. And then when they come and revisit it in Key Stage 4, I think most students do like the topic and they do kind of understand it. I think what students, going back to what we started with in the beginning of this chat, is the fact that I think most of them found the linking the words in it that makes the whole thing a lot more complicated than it really is. It is complicated, not to be mistaken here, but then I think having them appreciate the complexity of it and then trying to build on what they already know is going to be a really majorly important step to do in Key Stage 3. If, you know, introducing the topic to them and then building it on in Key Stage 4, and obviously further on in Key Stage 5 if they do it at that stage, and then they will start to realize codominance, dihybrid, inheritance, and all of that really wonderfully complexity stuff in it. But Yeah, so just to add on to what has already been mentioned here.
My final point before we move on, and is I really like the idea, Pritesh, of you thinking of doing ecology in September, because I can imagine heads of science across the country going, what? This is a summer term activity when we can go outside. No one does it in the autumn. And I really like that idea of just thinking about it differently and making it work, and not just accepting what's always been gone before, which I'm pretty certain in my 20 years, we'd have all the ecology topics would have been done in the summer.
Well, to turn that around, actually what we do is we'd start with chemistry, then go to physics, and then have biology at the end. But it's not so that we can necessarily go outside and do ecology stuff, but because the chemistry and physics put a lot of groundwork in about energy and like matter that would be useful when we talk about things in biology, like abiotic and biotic conditions.
Okay, now I think we better not get a wriggle on, but we've got a few more questions to get through here, and I suppose people's time's precious, ours and hopefully the one person that might watch this. So the next question is about just the order in which you would teach this. We've kind of discussed this, and Pritesh has absolutely got this customized order. Joe, have you got any thoughts you want to add? You might have mentioned them already, really, but is there anything else you want to add about the order for GCSE?
Well, actually, what I was going to say is very much linked to what everyone ended up talking about anyway, in terms of ecology. So at our school, the first biology topic we teach at Key Stage 4 is ecology. So we don't teach it right at the end, we teach it right at the start. And so it makes it quite easy for us to link back to it, I think, especially when we get to this topic, which, yes, unfortunately is at the end. But when we talk about speciation and, you talk about all the variation, etc., we can link back very easily to that topic, which was right at the start. And at Key Stage 3 as well, we tend to teach this much earlier on, just like Pritesh is going to do. And I think it works really well. We just changed that quite recently. And I think it really works well because we can link everything back to it as well, making it much more easy to understand, I think, for the students. But that was the only extra thing. I mean, besides that, we do tend to stick with the AQA. Although having said that, looking at Pritesh's sequence today, I'm thinking, nah, actually, we need to think more about how we can sequence our own lessons better.
Right, well, thanks for that one, Joe. All I can say is, like you, I've always taught it in the order, and in some respects, it's mainly when you write a scheme of work, you're often thinking about the non-specialists and trying to make it as simple for them as possible. But it's not always in the best for the students, I think, sometimes. We're on the home straight now, so I'm going to ask you about your approaches to teaching inheritance, variation, and evolution. And I'm going to share with you, to start with, a non-example, because those are quite popular, I believe, examples and non-examples. And in the days when I really was desperate to engage a class, I introduced evolution to my class with Fat Boy Slim's video, Right Here, Right Now. And I thought this might work because they were quite a tricky class. But the next thing I know, they've all got their phones out, they've turned their flashlights on, and they're waving them around in the classroom, and it's like a concert. I'm not entirely sure they got the message of the video, but it was in those dim and distant days when a starter and an engager was something that you would try. But Pritesh, hopefully you've got something a bit more sensible that you can suggest to us about your approach.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because the way I used to teach natural selection and evolution was to take all the kids outside in the class and play a game. And it used to be a game where, to even explain it, it gets quite complicated, but you've got people who are hopping around that are the prey, and then the predators running around, and then some of them who have a mutation, they can suddenly run instead of hop, and then after many generations you see evolution. And that's the way I used to teach it. And I quickly realized that the fun and games part preoccupied the pupils' minds far too much, and the actual thinking about selection and evolution didn't really cross their minds when playing the game. And whilst at the time I thought, you know, I'd come up with this brilliant game and, you know, what a great teacher I am, I actually realized I'm not actually teaching them anything. So I think, you know, everything we've talked about today, it's useful for a lot of purposes, in a sense that if you get the sequence right, and if you choose your examples well, and your curriculum is well sequenced, it can have a big impact. But I think even if you're in a position where your curriculum is far from being in the right sequence that you want it to, as I think most people will find, because sequence is something you always adapt, I think if your pedagogical approach is actually the biggest limiting factor for how much your pupils learn. So in my view, if your schemes of work and your lessons do look all like lots of games, lots of kind of posters around the room, lots of discovery learning, that kind of stuff, then it doesn't matter how brilliant your sequence is. The fact is, you may well be teaching lots of things, but the pupils aren't learning lots of things. And I think ultimately we need to judge a curriculum and its delivery by what the pupils learn. And I think more important than the curriculum sequence is the method of approach that you use to deliver your curriculum, whatever order that might be in. So for me, over the years I've been teaching, I've come to realize more and more that, and I've come to favor, as I'm sure isn't a surprise to anyone, using direct instruction or explicit instruction. And part of that is teachers in my department get together and we keep like a well-scripted explanation and lots of practice questions for pupils to answer that get them to rehearse the facts one at a time and eventually build up those facts, so that during all 55 minutes of a lesson that the pupils are working, they're thinking only about the content and about the knowledge and how it fits together, and asking lots of questions to pupils to ensure that I know that they've understood the thing that I want them to. So we have booklets which have our sequenced explanations and lots of questions, and any one lesson might involve the teacher giving a clear explanation from the front of the room, and whilst giving that explanation, firing questions non-stop at the pupils to get them to engage, to get them to answer, so that I can get a sense of how much they've understood, to get a sense of how much they've learned and remembered. And that is my way of ensuring that they progress with those ideas in the way that I want them to. I guess one of the reservations I had initially about this was, but don't the kids need variety when they're experiencing these lessons? Don't they just find it boring answering questions every day and then hearing my explanations every day and then doing more questions every day? And isn't that what the beauty of having different activities is? You know, one day you've got posters around the room, next day you've got a marketplace activity, the third day you're going out and you're playing a game of natural selection. Like, isn't that going to engage them more? And that used to really baffle me, to think, how do you decide what activity to do? Which one will suit this content better? And I think I eventually came to the conclusion that no, that's not the kind of variety pupils are craving. What they're craving is for them to be successful in lessons. And I think that by being really explicit in your instruction and having a clear explanation, if your teachers spend all their time planning a good explanation, the fact that pupils can follow is a thing that leads them to be successful, and that in turn leads them to feel motivated and enjoy those lessons. And so that would be my kind of my broad kind of brushstroke answer to that question of how I teach this topic.
Dom, I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I am muted. I'm trying to multitask and I'm failing badly. Joe, over to you. What are your thoughts? Joe, can you hear me?
Oh, I think she might have been frozen. Maybe.
Yeah. Well,
back to Joe.
I'll tell you what. Well, if we go on to Rachel, if you sort of share your ideas, and we'll see if we can get Joe back. I'll send her a message, a chat.
Yeah. I mean, I really understood what Pritesh was sharing about the whole activity thing, because I went through, definitely when I was doing my teacher training, I went through that phase of making sure, I need to get lots of really cool activities to engage the kids, to make sure they love the topic, and then hopefully if they like the topic, then they would start to learn more. But yeah, it felt miserably, let's just put it that way. The kids just didn't learn anything. They just enjoyed the process of going around the room, finding my fossil like laminates all around the room at different heights and everything. And it just didn't work very well. It was an interesting enough lesson. I think they kind of got it because it was a very small class, but then it wasn't very effective. It just wasted the entire hour away. So I really felt that when Pritesh was talking about the game stuff, because so yeah, we moved away from that, and we've been talking a lot about this on CogSci, which is about direct instructions and booklets and everything, and I think that is certainly the way to go, because I think students often look for these games or entertainment, or edutainment is the word that I tend to use, because they feel like they couldn't be successful in other things. So they kind of, I think, playing a game means that they have a lower chance to lose. And it's about, and actually I think it's a lot of it comes down to confidence in themselves, that they can actually grasp the topic and be good at it. So I think certainly booklets, I really like the idea of booklets, and I have been using it in the past year for sure with my year 11s when I teach the topic. And they really bought into it because they can see that the notes are there, right? All of the explanation is there, and the keywords are in bold so that they know what the keywords are. So the way that I often do it is because I've written the resources for these couple of topics. So I know my PowerPoint, and I've been changing it over the years. And so I would have examples of like green fluorescent protein when I talk about genetic engineering, insulin, etc., or lots of different examples of adaptations. And I would use those illustrations to explain the concept to them and answer any questions that they have, which they often do. And then they would read the explanation again in their booklets and highlight any particular key points, and then practice loads and loads of core questions that follows in the booklet after the notes. So it's about giving an opportunity for them to consolidate what they've just learned and to test themselves, for sure. And I'm also really big on retrieval practice, because I think certainly in biology as well, like the kids actually have to learn a lot of stuff in the whole spec, not just in this topic. So I'm really, really big on retrieval practice, hence the retrieval roulette with 819 questions. So I really like the idea about the starter. Sometimes I do put on, especially when I teach fossils, I do put on a fossil song, which anyways is quite interesting to start with. It's a bit funny and it's a bit cringy, but then actually I've moved away from it a bit more. I start every lesson with 5 to 10 retrieval questions on the screen, and I say, okay, go to you know the drill now. Go to the back of the book and write your answers down without looking at your notes. And then they would just sit down and just get on with the questions, and then we pick different people to check their understanding. And usually the questions were based on the lesson before, because obviously everything kind of has a link as a sequence. So it's always going to be based on lessons before, or even something they've learned in year 10 or year 9, to make sure that they have enough knowledge at the start of the lesson to understand the content that I'm actually going to deliver in that hour. So retrieval for me is a massive thing. So actually the booklets I use have all of the retrieval questions for that topic at the end, and then they just have to practice over and over again. And I give them lots of quizzes actually every now and then, and say, okay, you've done these questions before, let's see if you can get them right again. Because they start off complaining about, yeah, I'll get them definitely right, and then they don't. And then they start to learn, oh yeah, I actually don't know the stuff. And I think once they've tried that process of constant practice, they may complain to begin with, and actually the boys do complain. But then once they realize why get them to do this, why retrieval practice is good, and they start realizing, oh, actually I do remember this fact, this just simple like keywords for natural selection or things that they have to know about evolution, they start to really buy into that method and they start using it themselves. So for me, it's not just teaching the knowledge, but also the method of learning. For at least that's something that I really pick up in my lessons as well, and making sure they know all the keywords and everything. In terms of, and also the other thing, I sometimes I also explicitly, I know this is a bit controversial, but I explicitly teach misconceptions. So for example, when we talk about evolution, I would say a lot of people, 90% of you is going to write this answer about telling me how animals can choose to adapt to, like giraffes can choose to have their necks grow longer because the trees are taller. I said, I'm telling you now, 90% of you are going to do this, so don't do it. And then I teach them the actual proper answer. And then usually they kind of get the idea, it's like, okay, right, that's wrong. And then do that. But I know that there is a bit of debate on this one because there is a chance of the kids suddenly incorporated that instead of the real thing. So we have to be very careful when we do this one. And the last thing that I would talk about is the fact that rather than playing songs or games, I try to make sure that it's like, if I do practicals or demo, I try to make sure it's meaningful and not just make it look interesting, because it can very easily be a fully like didactic topic, because it's hard to do practicals in this topic since it takes over a couple of generations. So examples I would like an easy one would be speciation, I think, for evolution. So I get them to all draw the same sort of like a little picture about this little guy, like make a fluffy little ball with eyes and everything, with 2 legs and everything. And then I say, okay, right, we have and maybe everyone will draw a slightly different animal. And I say, okay, some of you have drawn wings, some of you haven't, some of you draw gills and everything. And I will give each desk like a different sort of environment. So for example, okay, this table is now flooded, like your island has been flooded, or your island has disappeared and you have to now all somehow survive in the air. And then they start realizing, oh wait, hold on a second, it's not the fact that I can't change from having no wings to having wings now. My animal is going to have to die, like it's not going to be able to survive. To illustrate the idea, like you can't adapt to a particular environment. If you don't get it, you just don't survive. And then they start to realize about how evolution happens over a long period of time. So it's a little bit, for me, I guess, it's a bit more meaningful than me trying to put posters around the room and everything. And another thing I do like to do, especially when we talk about genetic engineering, is to use a beads demo. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I have a string of beads and some beakers and scissors to illustrate, desired genes. Like I'm using the enzymes to cut out desired genes and then fitting it into round beads, which are the plasmids and everything, and use that model to demonstrate keywords to help them understand the process of genetic engineering. But other than that, it's hard to do practicals, I think, which you can do in quite a lot of other topics. This one's a bit more difficult. So for me, it's just mainly booklets and lots of questions and lots of retrieval practice and finding lots of exam question practice. Okay.
Thanks, Rachel. Let's, Joe, some thoughts for you now that you're back with us, and then I think we'll be summing up.
Yes, sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that Pritesh, and I'm sorry, Rachel, I missed some of that, but whatever I did hear, I do agree with that. I've been using booklets. In fact, I think I'm probably using your booklets, Rachel, or Adam Robbins' booklets, but they have been really, really useful to have everything sequenced and ready, especially the questions and the practice that is already built into them. And I found that really useful. In terms of practicals, I don't think I do anything. There used to be one with speciation with bird beaks and picking out different types of seeds using different implements. But that's something that I used to do years ago, and I'm not sure that actually helps in any way, because I don't think the students are actually thinking about speciation at all. I quite like your practical idea, Rachel, about your different desks having a different fluffy animal. And maybe what you could have said is, I don't know, maybe you said that already, but if you're talking about flooding, everyone's flooded. And then you have natural variation amongst the population, perhaps. And then the ones that are already adapted, they can survive and then pass on their alleles. I quite like all that. But I think what Pritesh was saying before about booklets and practice maybe being a bit boring, or people thinking about what activity should I do. I think the beauty of this topic is really in the stories that we can tell. There's so many amazing stories to share. We've got the DNA discovery story. I mean, I've learned so much about that recently, so much more to add to it. I'm excited to teach this again because I have more to talk about Rosalind Franklin as well. But there are so many other stories about how humans now can digest milk. That was something that I only recently read. I can't believe I didn't know about that before. That's a really good story about evolution as well to talk about, and the selection pressures that led to that. There's so many good stories that we can share in this topic. But I was also thinking about we mentioned Johnston's triangle earlier. And I was thinking if there is a version of this that we could use here in biology as well, by especially linking ecology and natural selection and putting that all in terms of the genes and the alleles, putting all of that in one frame. I mean, this is something I only recently thought about. I have not developed this idea whatsoever. But I'm wondering if that is something that we could also use. And I noticed that on some chats on CogSciSci recently, they were even talking about using this in physics. So it's very interesting how we can use something, this framework, to try and model the different concepts, and also linking the different parts of this topic, I think would be very interesting. So, but that's not something I have been doing. This is something I'm hoping to develop. But everything else that they said, I completely agree with.
Well, thanks, Joe. I think we've now hit the hour mark, so I think we really need to start thinking about summing up. So what I'm going to do here is say, Christian, Joe, and Pritesh, I'm going to ask you in 30 seconds, perhaps, to sum up sort of. I'll give you plus or minus 10%. That's okay. Sum up what you think students should know before they start this topic, and have you got anything that you think could supplement their learning that goes beyond the national curriculum requirements? So, Christian, start with you.
All right, I'm off. I think they should have a very good idea of natural selection, Darwinian style, pre-modern synthesis, natural selection in Key Stage 3. That's what they should be coming through. And you're building on that. You get to a point in year 9, as Pritesh says, where we can really establish the details. And I think that the molecular scale is something that we begin to dip into seriously in Key Stage 4. So that would be my advice. Bring up natural selection through Key Stage 3, get to a critical point in year 9, establish the Darwinian principles. He didn't know anything about inheritance. Just keep it to differential survival, reproduction, adaptation, cladistics, and things like that. And then in Key Stage 4, start digging deeper for the mechanisms at the lower levels.
Thanks, Chris.
Did I fit it in? Yeah.
Perfect.
Oh, brilliant.
Joe, over to you.
Sorry. I agree with Christian. The only thing I would add is I would also focus on ecology. So we can talk about adaptations and variation, link them in at Key Stage 3. Link that in with natural selection, as Christian just said. And then build on it and look at, like he said, the molecular level, look at alleles and genotype, phenotype, etc. at Key Stage 4. And then make it obvious that it's a model as well, all of it. And that we base it all on evidence as we go on. Very short.
Fantastic. Well done, Pritesh. No pressure now.
So I agree with what Christian and Joe said. The only thing I would add is lots of examples. And I think if the pupils in Key Stage 3 have at their fingertips lots of examples of different animals across different kind of families within the animal kingdom, of plants, perhaps a few fungi and bacteria, and their adaptations and the habitats in which they live, so the ecology examples, then everything you do beyond that, you can all say, let's link that back to this example that we know. Think about some animals in the desert, think about some animals in a rainforest. Can you give me examples of what we're talking about here? And if they can then say, oh yeah, I can link this new thing that I'm learning in Key Stage 4 to those examples that I've mastered in Key Stage 3, it suddenly makes the whole theory come alive with the examples that they've become enriched with.
Thanks, Pritesh. that time's flown by for me. So I thank you so much for taking part in the first biology CogSciSci chat. And it just leaves me to say, in the words of the great Dr. Bill Wilkinson, he might not, this is CogSciSci signing out. So thank you all very much.
Thanks, Dom.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.